Welcome to the Catbird Quilts. I'm Kathy Martin, and today's video is all about quilt backs and how you can use men's shirts and other items from the thrift store to make beautiful and budget-friendly backings for your quilts. And I have a lot to say about it. So behind me, if you haven't already noticed, there is this very bright, very beautiful, very fun and bold quilt with the back toward me. This is my older daughter's graduation quilt, and this is the back of it. This quilt backing is a woodland scene with little girls playing in trees and swinging and kitty cats on branches and various other things. And it's a lot of fun and it's very bright and happy. And it is a really great mix of the colors that are actually on the front of the quilt. And when I don't even know that I want to say most people, a lot of people think about quilt backs. This is what they think of. Floral prints are very common. Novelty prints are very common in quilt backs. I really like it. I really like it. And it's interesting. It matches the front. I'm going to reach down and pull the quilt back so you can see. So this is the quilt front. And you can see how there's some correlation in the colors and in the overall style, maybe, of the quilt. And since this was for my older daughter for her graduation, I wanted something that was almost reminiscent of her childhood and things that she loved. And so that's how I arrived here. Now, we have to talk about it. Quilt backings are expensive and they use a lot of fabric. Well, actually, that's the other way around. They use a lot of fabric and therefore can be very expensive. So this size quilt, which is roughly 78 inches by 90 inches, right around that twin size, requires sometimes almost as much as 8 yards of fabric. I can't remember how many I purchased. I usually over purchase when I buy fabrics like this that I love because I don't want to run out. And when especially if there's a print that I need to match up or try to match up, I want to make sure I have enough fabric. So if your fabrics are in the same price range as mine are, and I know they're not. My Canadian friends and my Australian friends, oh my goodness, I just feel like I want to apologize for how expensive your fabric is. It's crazy. But here, this fabric was, I think, around the $12 a yard range. And so let's say, for argument's sake, I bought 8 yards to be sure and cover what I needed. We're looking at a pretty penny, which reminds me, when I made my first quilt, I was standing in line at the cutting counter at the local quilt store, and a lady behind me, we got to talking, and she found out it was my first quilt, and she said, "Oh, it's a wonderful hobby. Expensive, but wonderful." And because I had used thrift store shirts on my first quilt, I didn't know what she was talking about. But I am from the South, and so I politely said, "Yes, ma'am," as if I knew what she was talking about. And she went on about her day, and I went on about my day. And then I ended up making more quilts and using local quilt store fabric or fabric I bought online, and I realized very quickly exactly what she meant. So this particular fabric, with as much as I bought, was substantial. Now, it was worth it to me because it was my daughter's graduation quilt, but it's a hefty price, and there's a lot of work involved in it. So in this situation, I had to attempt to match up the print seam it together, because obviously it's too wide to use, one strip of fabric. So if you get a print, there's matching the print. There is making sure you have the width that you need before it's quilted. One of the hard things about that is a lot of times there's a lot of waste, and it's like a knife in the heart when you have bought this beautiful fabric and made a beautiful backing with it, and there is so much that's cut away or that you waste when you put the pieces together. So that's some of what we're going to talk about today. But I wanted to show you this to start with, because I do think a lot of people, this is what they think of when they think of a quilt backing. And in fact, I have one of our channel viewers and now patron, Peg. She calls this party in the back. And she actually made that comment on the Patreon, I guess it's not really channel, account, on a video that I had put there. And I have laughed about that so many times, and that's going to be my new phrase. So thank you, Peg, for contributing to the Patreon community and giving me a new phrase for my quilt backings. So it very much is a party in the back, and it's great, but it was not inexpensive. And so I want to show you today some different things that you can do with thrifted items. And before I show you something new, I want to point out that even though this was fabric from the quilt store, sometimes you can find really decent yardage of printed fabric at your thrift store. I know I stumbled onto, I think it was like 6 yards of fabric in a small pale pink print, and I was floored. So if I was making a throw-sized quilt or a baby quilt, which is why I bought it. So for $1.99, I got 4 yards of fabric. So do not discount your fabric pile at your thrift store as an option. Another option for this sort of thing, if you want a printed back, you can use sheets from the thrift store. Sometimes you can find a really pretty printed sheet, and very often vintage sheets that have a really lovely print on them that will work. Also shower curtains. So I'm going to give you an example of that. We're going to have to do and change out the background. So I'll be right back. So here we are. Had to get just a little bit more mileage out of this quilt before it goes to my first cousin once removed, Brittany. It's going to her today, but I wanted to show you the back because this is a thrift store sheet, and I believe it was $2.99. I don't even know the price, but I know that it was less than $5. This is a perfect example of using a thrift store item. Well, it just happened that it was big enough to cover the entire back. So I did not have to piece it together at all. I didn't have to do the quilt back math, which now's a good time for me to stop and remind you. KitchenTableQuilting.com. Erica Jackman has a wonderful resource for figuring out your quilt backing. Now, her resource is for using yardage. So if you're going to do some of the techniques that I have done and that I'm going to talk about, you have to get creative. And I'll be totally frank with you. Geometry, not my thing. I'm an algebra girl. I think linearly. I think I think like an algebra person, not a geometry person. So if my descriptions are confusing, I really encourage you, go to KitchenTableQuilting.com. On her blog is a quilt back resource. It's fantastic. We'll put a link in the description box. So if you want to get there, you can do that. What is great about this, besides the fact that it's was $2.99 and covered the whole back, which is amazing. Imagine that. So the difference between $12 a yard for 8 yards, which I'm doing this on the fly, $96 without tax for the previous quilt versus $2 maybe, $2.99 for the whole quilt back. So there's some real savings to be had. And in these days, saving money, it's a good thing. So in considering this back, I was thinking of the front, and it has so many colors and so many squares that I really didn't want anything that would compete from that. And so let me show you what I'm talking about. So this is the quilt top, even though it's the front. I don't know. You can see it really has just a lot of color and a lot of interest. And for me, I could have gone to the local quilt store, picked out a fabric that had a lot of those colors in it and put it on the back. And it probably would have been lovely. But for me, I just wanted a simple, peaceful, calm looking back. And I had a $2.99 sheet that I had in my stash. So this is how I got here. And as I was considering the backing, I was considering what sort of quilting design. So if you're going to have a busy quilting design, having a plain back can be really lovely and enhance the quilting and not detract from the front. Once you realize, oh my goodness, this sheet was the perfect backing, it can really change how you view going to the thrift store, and it may be worth the time to go to that wall of linens where they have all the shower curtains and fitted sheets and the whole deal, and you think, oh, I've just spent an hour in the men's shirt department. I don't really want to go root through the sheets. But sometimes you stumble on the perfect sheet. So just remember that when you're thinking of how you can make your lovely quilts with thrift store items. So those are kind of two what I would consider standard quilt backings, which is a big swath of printed fabric and then the solid or plain background, backing, not background, that's on the front. Now I want to show you how you can use thrift store items to stretch fabric that you already have in your stash. So here I have a baby quilt that I made. Actually, this is the first quilt from the Your First Quilt series that I did. You may remember it's a gigantic gingham. And I had I think it was a white pillowcase, and it was just not quite big enough to do the width and the height. So it would cover, the length would cover this way, but it wouldn't go that way. And so what I did is I cut it down the middle, and then I got one of my men's dress shirts that I really loved, and the color worked with the colors on the front, and I just inserted that strip right down the middle. And I think I actually even had to piece that shirt, although I can't see it, so maybe not. I may not have pieced it. And so what it has done is it stretched that pillowcase and made it wide enough for this. I think it's 45 inches. And it gives the back a little interest. So there's this nice stripe right down the middle, which I could have turned it this way as well. This is an excellent way to stretch the fabric that you do have for your backing. So I have a couple of other examples of that. The quilts have gone on to their owners, so we're going to have to do some photographs, some screenshots for you. The one that really comes to mind the most is the gingham 9-patch that I recently finished. So I found this lovely fabric that was kind of an aqua and blue, and it I thought it looked like wallpaper. I thought it looked like lovely wallpaper. My friend Sissy that did the quilting said it looked like Lily Pulitzer fabric. And I loved it, but I really didn't want to do the entire back in that fabric, mostly because I didn't want to have to match up the print, which I did do. And actually, time out, let me give you an aside. Suzy Quilts has a wonderful tutorial on her blog for how to match prints for your backing. So when you have a repeating pattern and you're going to put it together and you don't want the seam to show, she has an excellent tutorial. Now, for some of you, it may be a little out of pocket because she uses glue sticks, but it works like a dream. You cannot tell if you do it, if you follow it step by step. So we'll put a link to that in the description. Kudos to Suzy, so helpful. So what I did in that case is I matched the print, seamed it together, and then did exactly the same thing that I did here, except I cut it this way and added a shirt fabric that matched the darker blue in the back and was tied into the general color scheme on the front. So it made the back a little more interesting. It stretched that fabric budget. So instead of having to buy 7 or 8 yards, I bought probably 3 or 4 and then seamed it together, cut it in half, and made it stretch. And then I have another one that's very similar situation, which was I had a dark gray, charcoal gray sheet that I had bought from the thrift store for almost nothing. And it was not quite big enough to cover the whole back. Like previously, the one that I just showed you on the 9-patch Trip Around the World quilt, it was big enough. This one was not. And so what I did in that case is I put a section at the 3rd mark, and then I did another stripe down the 3rd mark in. So it made like a cross section. And I did use the fabrics from the front of the quilt. So I tied the fabrics from the front to the back, made big strips of them, and just put those strips across the back. So it made the sheet go further and ended up with really like 2 quilts in one. So that's that. That will give you some ideas, maybe, hopefully, of how, if you have a limited amount of fabric, which is almost always the case with thrifted items, you just have what you have. You can't go back to the thrift store. So sometimes stretching that fabric is really important. One of the questions that comes up when doing this, I've had several people comment, is, well, don't you worry about matching up the front to the back. So if it's in a straight line or whatever, making sure they're squared up. And I want to give you an example of that so you can see how that can be done. So now we have moved on to pieced quilt backs. And it may surprise you, or maybe not, that my very first quilt, I did a pieced back. Did not know what I was doing, truly, was learning very first quilt. The reason why I did a piece back, just in brief, was I loved this plaid. I loved it. And it's a men's shirt, and I wanted to use it so badly. And it clashed with the colors on the front. And so I, in my naivete, ignorance, and arrogance, was like, oh, I'll just put it on the back. And I did. And so I made this block and then did the kind of frame around it. And because all I had really was shirts to work with, I used shirt backs for these white pieces. So this is not yardage. This is men's shirts. And then I did this border and then that border, all men's shirts. And in my mind, which at the time seemed completely reasonable, and I've come to realize actually is completely reasonable, I just didn't have the skill at the time, is, well, I mean, I'm just doing what's on the front, on the back. So I literally made the exact pattern on the back that's on the front. And as I was getting ready to make the quilt sandwich, it hit me. Oh, I'm not going to be able to see the front or the back when I'm making the quilt sandwich. And so I had just a brief glimpse into the challenge, perhaps, of matching the front and the back. And then I remembered math works. If the math for the front is right and the math for the back is right, it will line up. And it might be off a little, but it will line up. So I flip-flopped the design, made the back, and then laid the backing down on my floor and took a deep breath and said, here we go. So I want to show you what I'm talking about. If you have not seen this quilt, which you probably have if you've been with me for any amount of time, the front is basically all blue shirts, and then the back you obviously can see, but there is a yellow insert on the front, and that's it right there. And so what I really wanted, spoiler alert, did in fact happen. I wanted them to be the same front to back. And if you want to see a little bit more, that's the quilt. And I have done a video on this. So if you're interested in seeing the whole thing, you can check out the quilt story on it. The way that I did it, though, is I laid the backing face down, taped it down good, marked the centers of each side, put the batting down, marked the center of it, and then when I aligned the top, the quilt top on it, I just matched up the centers of each side, top and bottom. So if it's centered this way and this way through the center, it will be square. And then as I was pinning, there's no great thing about doing a quilt sandwich. I take it all back. There's almost nothing redeeming about doing the quilt sandwich except that you get a quilt sandwich. I felt through to the floor. So I had it on my living room floor, had the batting down, had the quilt top, and as I was pinning, I could feel the seams. And when I tell you, it is remarkably close. So this seam is on the line. I'm feeling it right now. This seam is on the line. One of them I missed by like 1/4 of an inch. I can't remember which one it is. That one's on the line. It must be here. Yeah. So if you choose to go this route and you want to basically make the same quilt on the back that you have on the front, number one, probably good if you have a pretty simple design. This is not a very complicated design. It's just big rectangles around this square. You want to do a simple design. And second of all, if you do your math right, if you cut your pieces properly and according to the pattern, and you think through, for example, since this was asymmetric, I had to do that mirror image, it's going to line up. You just there's almost like you just have to have faith in math because it will work. Since we're talking about pieced backings, some of you love a pieced backing, and some of you are like, that is a lot of work. And it is. It's a lot of work. And I'll be honest with you, sometimes my quilt backing choices really have everything to do with my energy and time. And sometimes just artistic vision. Sometimes I just don't have a plan for it. And sometimes I think, oh, you know what would be great? It would be great. Oh, gosh, no, I can't. I can't even. And then sometimes I have this idea like, I could use this plaid on the back and make the front and the back the same. And the energy that I get from that vision and creativity and problem solving is enough to propel me forward into actually spending this time and energy to make this. Either way, if your if your quilt is bigger than a baby size, you're going to have to do some kind of piecing unless you buy the yardage that's 108 inches wide. But most of us are going to have to do at least one middle seam and maybe more. And so if you have the time or energy or interest or artistic vision, sometimes it feels worth it. And so after I did this, by the way, the next quilt was solid cloth. But then the next quilt after that, which was the checkerboard quilt that I made for my friend Tiffany, I did something very similar. I had this idea that I was going to use a micro gingham in tan because I thought it would be really lovely neutral. But then as I was piecing it together, I was like, this is not interesting enough. And the front of that quilt had every color of the rainbow. And so I had an idea that what I would do is exactly what I have done in a couple of those other examples. I put it right down the middle, not this way. I went this way with it. And I used the rainbow and pulled ginghams and checks from every color to make that swath that then extended my micro gingham and made the back really something special. And that's what I wanted for my friend Tiffany. I wanted the back to be as special as the front. And it was worth it to me to spend that time and energy doing that. And so that brings me to my last example, which is the one that I just recently talked about on my sewing table. And it is a pieced back that uses the offcuts from my snowball corners on my magnolia quilt that I'm working on, and I want to show it to you. So this is my magnolia, well, not my magnolia quilt, but the magnolia quilt that I've been working on. I've talked about this on one of my last videos, which was the On My Sewing Table, how I made the confetti back with the little corners cut from the snowballs from the front. Let me show you a little piece of the front. So pardon all the pins, this is the quilt sandwich, but I wanted to use it as an example. So this was the inspiration fabric, used a lot of these triangles on the back. And as I was just mentioning, sometimes I use thrifted fabric to stretch my fabric from the quilt store. And sometimes it's the other way around. And that's what we have here. So I made these confetti corners because I wanted the back to be fun and have some sort of reference to the front. It is really fun and interesting. It's very neutral and calm, though. I don't think I had anticipated how soothing and calming this gray would be. But the gray is a sheet, and I had gotten it from the thrift store for, almost nothing, a couple of dollars, maybe $1. And when I laid it out, I realized that it was a fitted sheet, not a flat sheet. And so if you have ever taken a fitted sheet apart, the corners are missing. So instead of this nice big flat sheet, what I had was a nice big flat sheet with a huge chunk of corner out of every corner. So I had to cut that, piece that, and I didn't have to, I wanted to. Cut that and pieced it, and then cut it down and made the confetti corners. And again, you may be thinking, you're crazy, and you would be right. But I had this vision for it and I was excited about it. And so I did it. And then once I realized that I had my confetti back made, the gray and the confetti was not big enough to cover the entire backing once I put the border on the front, the way Chelsea Stratton had intended with the quilt pattern. So I improvised. Got this darker gray that's kind of a little bit mushroomy and made a big wide border. so that I would have enough for the quilting. The fabric that I bought, ordered, actually extended what was thrift store fabric and what would have been waste fabric. You never know which way it's going to go. You never know if your thrift store fabric is going to save the day and extend your quilt store fabric, or vice versa. In this case, it's vice versa. And I think it turned out really interesting. It probably looks a little crinkly and weird right now because of all of the safety pins in it. As you might imagine, a lot of this dark gray is going to get cut off once it's quilted and completed and bound and all that good stuff. But it did actually do what I thought it would do, which is it provided a border, kind of frames up what I've made here, and it gives that extra overhang so that I'm not cutting it too close when I'm doing the quilting. And so when I did this quilt sandwich, I did exactly what I said I did. So I marked the center, and then when I put my batting down, I marked the center again. And then because the quilt front, the quilt top, has a center sashing, I centered the sashing on that line. And I did the same here. So you can see this is the sashing right here. This is my center mark. And I just made sure that those two were lined up as close as possible. And so what should happen, when I go to quilt this on my machine, because it's centered on these two sides and on these two sides, it should stay pretty straight. And if it's not straight, no one will know. No one will know. Because when you're using the quilt, the backing is underneath. And if you happen to want to flip it over, then the top is underneath. So no one is going to be holding it up to the light going, she didn't get that quite right. Certainly not my friend who I'm going to give this to. So that's where I want to end for today. Just this idea of you can make your quilt backs as interesting as you like. You can stretch your fabric budget very easily by using shirts and shower curtains and sheets. And I know people use blankets. Flannel sheets are wonderful, especially if you're going for one of those cozy winter quilts. They work fantastic because it is nice and soft and cozy and wonderful. You can do that. And I'm sure there are 1,000 other ways. I hope this has been informative and fun, maybe, and hopefully giving you some inspiration for ideas for your own quilt backs. I'm Kathy Martin. This is the Catbird Quilts. Thank you so much for watching. Or sometimes you can find a really printy part of another consideration. I don't like the way I started out the sentence. Stop. So yeah, it's bad. Yeah, I'm struggling. No, I'm just real struggling. It's okay. So we've been through solid, printed back. No, let me just start again. I'm so annoyed. Oh my goodness. Okay, am I good? Yeah.